to this video. On this video, I'm going to be going through the history of groove. We're going to be looking at the development of swing. We're going to be looking at the development of funk. What makes beats funky and how that came about. Because funk is definitely an invention of the 20th century. Okay? There's all sorts of different aspects of music, but funk is quite a strange phenomenon. It's quite a visceral aspect of music, and it's very hard to actually explain what that feeling is. The only way to describe it is it's a funky feeling, and I think I know some of the elements that create funk, that create groove, and I think that when we're looking at funk is really has evolved out of swing, and swing is the forerunner of funk, and swing was the thing that made jazz so likeable and accessible in the 1920s, that really created popular music. The idea that you could dance to something that wasn't just a beat, but had something inside it that made you want to dance. Now, when we look at the origins of jazz, what we're looking at is a whole bunch of different rhythms, some from marching music, some from European classical music, some from African music, although African music will have come through a sort of a historical tunnel to emerge in the 1890s, Latin American music. There's a whole host of different musics flitting around. One thing that we see in African music, in Latin American music, is the phenomenon of a 3-against-2 polyrhythm. All right. So if you imagine I'm playing 3 here. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Right. And then if I play on the 1, I'm going to hit the snare drum. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. Right. So 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Now this rhythm here is a 3-against-2 polyrhythm. Existing at the same time, 2 different rhythms. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And this one. 1, 2. Now, imagine, rather than feel it in 3, we're now going to feel it in 2. So you've got. And we're feeling the time like. This rhythm is very, very common in African music, where you would often hear things like this. That is just a straight 3/2 rhythm played on the toms, and it's an African sound. But also in Latin American music, you have things like a clave, like this. Again, we're hearing 3-against-2. These are very, very common sounds in these African-derived rhythms. But what's interesting with jazz originally is they're not being played on African instruments. Of course, when Africans were brought to America as part of the slave trade, in America they had their instruments taken away from them. And when we get into the 19th century, the instruments that are there are marching instruments. Now, what we have here with the drum kit is basically the fundamental instruments that you would have in a marching band. So in a marching band, we would have the snare drum. We would also have the bass drum. Now these instruments would all be played separately and people would have marched. So you would have had someone with a snare drum slung around them and they're playing that snare drum, and then alongside them is the bass drums and they're playing boom, 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 boom. And that's what we have down here, the bass drum. also, you would have had the guys that would have had two cymbals and they would be clashing them together. And these cymbals would have leather handles on them and you would slash them together. Well, this hi-hat here is basically an emulation of that. So we have this. So if I put all those three things together, you will hear the sound of a marching band. Now, part of the grooviness or funkiness of marching music, if you listen to Sousa marches, is the fact that they are accentuating the upbeat. So if you're feeling the time here, the upbeat would be here. That is the aspect that comes from marching music. Now, what would happen if we took these three instruments and we were to stick a 3/2 polyrhythm on it? Well, here's a 3/2 polyrhythm on the snare drum. Here's the 2. So let's add the bass drum and the hi-hats in on that. There is your 3/2 polyrhythm played on the snare drum. Now let's do what marching bands do, and we're going to syncopate it. We're now going to play it on the upbeat. So rather than it being here, I'm going to play it here. Now we have an adaptation of marching beat and we've stuck in this 3/2 polyrhythm. Let me explore that to see what is in there and what sort of sound makes this different to a straight marching beat. So suddenly, this marching rhythm has a sort of deeper propulsive thing, because the reason is that this is what funkiness is. It's feeling two rhythms at once, and those two rhythms interacting with each other. So half of your body is feeling the rhythm, but the other half is feeling something that's against the rhythm. And that makes you feel slightly confused in a nice way. So basically, original New Orleans frontline drumming, right, is an adaptation of marching music. Now, in 1897, Didi Chancellor, who was an African-American jazz drummer, decided to create a pedal so he could play this with his foot. And that meant he could play the bass drum and the snare drum at the same time. Now, this was obviously a cost-cutting device that was used for him to be able to get the gig. Just hire me, I'll do bass drum and snare drum together. The hi-hats, this hi-hat stand was originally called a low boy. It was just pedal operated, and these two cymbals were much lower. And this emerges around about the 1920s, I think 1925. And eventually people started to play that low boy, and so they brought the hi-hats up here. All right. So your original jazz drumming probably sounded something like this. as this is emerging, you've got silent movies have become massive. And a lot of musicians are playing in the bands that are providing the music to the silent movies. One of the first drummers in recorded history would be Baby Warren Dodds. Baby Dodds was working in one of these cinemas, and in there they had what were called contraptions. These were sound effects things that you would have to basically embellish the sound of the cinema. And these start to be added to the drum kit. Cymbals get added, tom-toms get added, wood blocks, cowbells, all sorts of sounds are added to this drum kit. And these contraptions, that is then shortened to traps. So the reason why some people call the drum kit a trap kit or traps is because of that. And the reason why we call it a kick drum is because those early drummers before D.D. Chandler invented the bass drum pedal were actually kicking the drum. So now we've got this sound, right? And that is what I imagine everybody was playing in, say, 1915. You were playing in jazz. When they start to record the bands, it was impossible to record this because it's too loud. And the original systems they used, cylinder recordings, it would have just messed up the recording. So around about the time the hi-hats are invented, people are turning up to the studios and they're saying, this beat you're playing, can you transfer that to the hi-hat? And we get this. Now this sound here, if you listen to the 3/2 polyrhythm, now if we played that with just one hand, that would be. That's a little bit of a handful. Let's just simplify it. Those early drummers who were so used to pulling all these weird sounds at the drums because of silent films, with the hi-hat, they would then hold this hi-hat, so you've got a splashy sound, and they would get this sound. I tried to show you how that sound evolved. So there's some people that say the proper way of playing that jazz hi-hat pattern is like this. Close, and then 2 opens. And then there's other people who play it like this, 2 close and an open. I tend to be somewhere in between the two. The purists say it should be done the first way. So when the big bands come in, what the big bands do is they're playing like this. And the brass punctuates, so the drums would punctuate then. They go. The bass drum being lightly feathered, because the bass is so important here. On this video, I'm going to be adding bass to some of these so you can hear the context a little bit better. So when you add bass to it, the bass, which is a double bass, the drummer is then feathering this bass drum really lightly. So let's try that, and I'll add some bass to it, and you can hear how that bass drum's very lightly supporting the bass drum. 1, 2, 1, 2. Then the beboppers come along. That rhythm has been, that swing rhythm has been on the snare drum. It's now moved out to the hi-hat. And now they move it to the ride cymbal. And we play that swing here, and we start punctuating between the bass drum and snare drum based upon those punctuations that married up with the stabs and hits and answers that you would get in a big band. So we get this sort of sound. with your bebop drumming happening at the same time, you get a reduction of the big bands down to much smaller groups, so they can be recorded easier, it's cheaper to tour them, and we get the jump up rhythm and blues bands in the 1940s playing the same rhythm, but they start to place that backbeat, right, that heavy 2 and 4 beat onto the snare drum like this. So I will play the swing beat with the bass drum and then add the backbeat in. Now, that is the beat that we first hear with Bill Haley in the Comets in the early rock and roll. But there's another influence coming in rhythmically into rock and roll, which has come through rhythm and blues, and that's boogie woogie piano playing, and that's much straighter. It hasn't got this swing feel, it's got a much straighter, like 16th note feel. It's that type of feel. And drummers start to try and adapt what they are playing on the drums, these swingy beats, to that straight feel, and we start to get drum beats like this. Around this time in the late 50s, you get all sorts of different drummers somewhere between these two fields. Now, with the beginning of the backbeat in the 60s, you now get British drummers from all over the country and western drummers, and they're playing a very simple 2 and 4 beat like this. So if you think of Ringo Starr when he first emerges in the 60s playing Love Me Do, that's the beat he's playing. But what's funny is that even though he's playing straight time, that triplety feel, that swingy 3 feel, is within it. It's suggested. He's not actually playing it, but it's suggested. So that is something that emerges in early rock and roll, right? Now, at some point in the 1960s, and I really lay this with Ringo's feet, Ray Charles's band bringing in sort of Latin American derived beats, so you start to get this sort of beat coming in. And you start to see this tension building up until finally, and I would place this with Bob Dylan, I'm afraid, with, if you think of when he brings a band in and they do Subterranean Homesick Blues, on that record they're playing one of those sort of Ringo Starr-y type shuffles. It's come out of rhythm and blues. So anyway, with the release of the tune Like a Rolling Stone, we get this rhythm coming. This is a big change in drumming. This is your rock beat now. Now, I'm not saying Bob Dylan did it first, I'm not saying Ringo did it first. There's a slow evolution. You can hear certain Motown tracks, you know, certain soul tracks, all sorts of different they're slowly forming into this beat. But there's a point I want to make here, which is I think where funkiness comes from. Because if we go back to the swing feel, and now we're going to imagine the swing feel is in underlying a rock beat. So I'm going to play a swing feel, right? I want you to feel that, okay? And then I will go into the rock beat, and I want you to feel how I am suggesting that swing beat underneath the rock beat. So we've got this time here on the hi-hat. It's straight time, but there's a swing feel suggested. That's where the funkiness comes. You're feeling straight time, but you're also feeling this three feel. It's really subtle. And then the syncopation starts to get pushed to the max. And if we take that bebop style of drumming, where people are playing swing and then interacting between the snare drum and the bass drum, that approach, if we now apply that into this rock feel, we start to get a dialogue going on between the left hand on the snare and the bass drum. And the great breakthrough is in 1967 with the track Cold Sweat by James Brown. And on there, Clyde Stubblefield plays a beat which has all that funky feel, has the underlying swing, and it also shifts. He displaces on the second part of the bar the beat over, and you feel that tug when you feel it. And that sounds like this. And in 1967, that's where funk is born. Now, what's the actual elements going on here? Well, I got this time here. You feel that? And then we got the interaction between the bass drum and the snare Now, another thing's happening here as well, dynamics. On the snare drum, some of my snare drum hits are accented, that means I hit them hard, and some of them are quiet. If we take any rhythm, if I was to go, right, which is like the football chant rhythm. Now, without thinking, I'm actually adding in dynamics, but I'll do it much more exaggerated now, so we go. Now that's the same rhythm, but with different dynamics in. Or I could go. All right. Now on the drums, the way you play dynamics, if you know what you're doing, is you use a technique called molar technique. So what I'm doing is when restricted here from the wrist is giving me my little strokes. But my big strokes are done by passing energy down my arm in a wave. So if I was to play straight beats, accent every three, we'd get this pattern. Now that approach on the drums also plays into the feel of funkiness. So if we were to go back to that big band swing, right, and take this rhythm. See how I'm accenting it? I'm accenting the up. 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now if I put this over to here, we start to get all these texture shuffles and the underlying grooviness behind the blues like this. So here it is without dynamics. And here it is with dynamics. So if I take that shuffle and halve the time, as you just heard there, we suddenly have what is basically a half-time shuffle. Now, half-time shuffles can be very sophisticated. The great drummer Bernard Purdie, who played for Aretha Franklin in the early 70s and played with Steely Dan, he would play that half-time shuffle and really bring out the 3 feel, and you'd get this type of groove. This feel is what the early rock drummers picked up on. Drummers like Ian Pace, drummers like John Bonham were pulling from these types of drummers. And so with Bonham, you get that. So a lot is made of those triplets on the bass drum, but the point is they're triplets. We're feeling straight time, but when Bonham puts those triplets in, we start to feel a counter rhythm. Throughout the 70s, drummers try and find a lot of other ways to get funky, and people like David Garibaldi, who else would be doing this? Steve Gadd. They start to play what you could call linear drumming. By the mid-70s, all this funkiness starts to get simplified, and people just want to hear a 4-on-the-floor bass drum, and we get the advent of disco. And disco is basically this. But to get the feel of the syncopation of the upbeat or the offbeat, people start to open the hi-hat on that, so you get this. These sorts of rhythms are very easily replicated by machines, and with the advent of the drum machine in the 1980s, it's these sort of rhythms that are easily programmed, and then drummers start to take influence from that. Once sampling comes in, people now can sample these drum beats from the 60s and the 70s, and they can speed them up. So if we take, say, that Cold Sweat beat by Clyde Stubblefield with James Brown, if I sample that and then speed it up, speed the sample up, I get this. By putting that into a sampler, we can now start to cut it up and change the start points, and we can start to displace it even more, and we start to get beats like this. In rock drumming, the bass drum starts to become more important. The bass drum now can be recorded in the recording studio. The first drummer really to do this was the drummer with the Hollies. I've forgotten his name, but they were in Abbey Road, I think, and he said, "Is there any chance you could put a microphone inside the bass drum?" And the whole world changed. And then rock drummers start to try and do more with the bass drum. Now, big band jazz drummers have been playing 2 bass drums, but suddenly in the 70s we start to see the 2 bass drums in. Now, I haven't got 2 bass drums, but I've got a pedal. So we start to get different grooves coming in. Billy Cobham famously on the Spectrum album, takes the sort of big band shuffle and underpins it with double bass drums. He'd really taken this from Louis Belson, who had been doing it with the Duke Ellington Orchestra in the 1950s, and we start to get patterns like this. Starts with this swing feel, and then drummers start to straighten it out, and we get that sort of very familiar. These influences are apparent on drumming, but underneath it all are these factors. A, the idea of syncopation, of the beat not being on the downbeat where you feel it, but being on the other side. B, the sort of suggestion that there's a 3 feel against a 2 feel. And C, the use of dynamics through molar technique on the drums to create some rhythm that is shuffling up and down. I feel that with the advent of computers, digital audio workstations, Pro Tools, this aspect of drumming, this subtle shift, this subtle placement of time, has been ironed out of music. Now, there's another thing we need to mention here, and it's the idea of pocking. So if I've got a snare, if I'm playing a straight rock beat, here's a straight rock beat. I'm now going to just put that snare drum slightly behind where it should be. And there, towards the end of that, I started to bring in, the same sort of displacement on the hi-hat, messing with the groove, because that is what makes it feel funky. That's what presses against you as a player. The fusion drummers and the prog drummers, they start to bring lots of odd time signatures in there. Now, it's hard to play odd time signatures, but it's even hard to play them with the groove. So say we were playing in 7. So you could see that you can apply these funky things into odd time signatures, and it brings the groove out of them. And these are all the things that have been happening in drumming over the last 40, 50 years. So I'm going to finish this now with, I'm just going to do a bit of an open solo, but I'm going to try and really create a groove, and then I'm going to try and mess with that groove and see where we start, okay?